The Seminoles are known today as some of the fiercest warriors this side of the Mississippi, but their war against the colonists was mostly defensive in nature, and over time they picked up many aspects of European culture, including trading firearms, livestock, and slaves. The system of slavery practiced by the Seminole was a bit different than that in the colonies, and many slaves were eventually able to gain their freedom, and their numbers were bolstered by a trickle of black Americans fleeing to Seminole lands. This created a class known as the Black Seminoles, or Afro-Seminoles, who were largely assimilated into native society. The Afro-Seminoles later spread out to the Bahamas, Texas, Oklahoma, and even northern Mexico to avoid enslavement, and today there are a few thousand remaining throughout North America, although their unique Creole dialect is in danger of extinction.
Right. Before I begin, I just want to thank everybody that's here on the Zoom. The history of the Black Seminoles is something that is very important to me. And for you to be taking time out of your Saturday to listen to this talk is really humbling. So I hope that you enjoy what I have to say. And I feel like I'm going to be throwing a lot of information at you. So please feel free to ask any. This is a very complex history that has a lot of moving parts to it. So it's not easy if this is the first time you're hearing about it to get everything in one take. So, at the end, feel free to ask any questions and I will answer them to the best of my ability, or we'll send you in the right direction. So the title of my talk is The Black Seminoles of Texas and Mexico. Right. All I want right now is each day for one more person to learn our history. This quote was by Ms. Charles Emily Wilson. She lived from 1910 to 2006. And this is quoted in the book Our Land Before We Die by Jeff Gwynne. When most of us learned about slavery in school, we were taught that those who escaped ran north in search of freedom. The story of those who ran south is not as well known, and I hope y'all see what I just did there. I am a descendant of those who ran south. It is my honor to tell you the story of the Black Seminoles. Their story, in my humble opinion, is a truly and uniquely American story. The ethnogenesis of the Black Seminoles. One of my favorite quotes is by legendary filmmaker Haile Gerima, who said many enslaved Africans didn't wait for Lincoln to free them. And this is true. For many of our enslaved forebears, as soon as they realized that their freedom was being taken from them, they began searching for ways to get it back. We know and have heard about the many lives lost to the sea during those harrowing and numerous voyages on slave ships. And if they survived that journey, as soon as their feet touched this unknown land known as America, many Africans began resisting, fighting, and running. They ran until they found refuge. La Florida. Right. When the Spanish first arrived in Florida, there were, of course, already indigenous inhabitants. The idea was for these indigenous peoples to be forced into helping the Spanish protect their claim to this territory. Unfortunately, contact with Spaniards brought disease, and many of these early Native Americans succumbed to these illnesses. In addition, numerous attacks from American settlers brought about more death. Within a short amount of time, those original inhabitants had all but been wiped out. Following the near decimation of these original Floridian inhabitants, enslaved Africans and various Native American tribes were encouraged to seek refuge in Florida by Spanish authorities. Right. It is believed that enslaved Africans had been finding freedom in Spanish Florida from as early as 1689. The Low Country of the United States. The majority of these formerly enslaved Africans, or maroons, were gullahs, or Gullah Geechees, who were running from an area known as the Low Country region of the United States, or more specifically, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Northern Florida. Even though the group was enslaved, they lived in relative isolation from their white captors for long periods of time. This allowed this group of Africans from various parts of Central and West Africa to develop their own culture, which included their own language, which is an English-based Creole known as Gullah Geechee or Gullah Geechee. Initially, the Maroons who escaped into Florida lived apart from the Seminoles, who were a small group of Creeks that had separated from the larger group of Creeks because of a growing number of cultural and moral differences. There were also other smaller tribes that would eventually join this group that would become known as the Seminoles. The word Seminole is believed to come from the Creek or Muscogee word Seminole. The word Seminole may have been adopted from the Spanish word cimarron, which means runaway or wild one. And it's also believed that the word maroon comes from the Spanish word cimarron as well. By the early 19th century, the Maroons, who had established themselves as corn and rice farmers, and the Seminoles were in regular contact with each other. It is important to acknowledge that some Seminoles did practice slavery. It was not the chattel slavery that was practiced in Southern America by white slave owners, but it was slavery nonetheless. It was, however, more like a feudal taxation, since the Maroons typically lived in their own communities. During the 1820s, there were about 800 Maroons living among approximately 4,000 Seminoles. And historians point out that these Maroon settlements, which were often located on the outskirts of Seminole settlements, were highly militarized. In exchange for an annual tribute of livestock, crops, hunting, and war party obligations, Maroons found sanctuary among the Seminoles, who in turn acquired an important strategic ally in a sparsely populated region. The Maroons elected their own leaders and could amass wealth in cattle and crops. Most importantly, they bore arms for self-defense. Florida real estate records show that the Seminoles and Maroons owned large quantities of Florida land.
Right? There was no such thing as a black Seminole. You will never find in history books nothing that said black Seminole. Nothing. Right?
Following the War of 1812, and just ahead of the Seminole Wars, the Maroon community became known as Black Seminoles.
There was no such thing as a black Seminole. You will never find in history books nothing that said black Seminole. Nothing.
They were also called Seminole Negroes by their white American enemies, and Estelusti, which means black people, by their Native American allies.
Right? Seminole was applicable to the Native or Negro element.
Spoke for itself.
It spoke for itself.
I got you.
The Seminole Wars were efforts by the United States to remove Seminoles and Black Seminoles from Florida.
There was no such thing as a black Seminole. You will never find in history books nothing that said black Seminole.
Nothing?
Nothing.
This is too easy. The Black Seminoles, Gullahs who escaped from slavery. The Black Seminoles are a small offshoot of the Gullah who escaped from the rice plantations in South Carolina and Georgia. Some Gullah... Nothing?
Nothing. Right?
The Seminole Wars were efforts by the United States to remove Seminoles and Black Seminoles from Florida, and there were three distinct wars. The First Seminole War. Successfully winning independence in the American Revolution emboldened American slaveholders, who now turned their attention to armed Black communities in La Florida. After switching from Spanish control to British, it was now under Spanish control again. This, however, did not stop the United States from seeking to capture and return so-called Black fugitives under the Treaty of New York of 1790. This was the first treaty ratified under the Confederation. After the War of 1812, General Andrew Jackson attacked Fort Negro. He did this because he wanted to disrupt the Black Seminoles who had set up communities in Florida. He would go on to lead several excursions into La Florida, ignoring the protests of the Spanish and the British. During the First Seminole War, which took place from approximately 1816 to 1819, breaking up these Black Seminole communities was one of Jackson's main objectives. Unfortunately, Spain was unable to protect its territory, so La Florida was eventually ceded to the United States per the Adams-Onis, excuse my pronunciation of that, Oni Treaty of 1819. In 1821, the official transfer took place according to the terms of the 1823 Treaty of Moultrie Creek between the United States and the Seminole Nation. The Seminoles were removed from northern Florida to a reservation in the center of the Florida Peninsula, and the U.S. constructed a series of forts and trading posts along the Gulf and Atlantic coast to enforce the treaty. These initial efforts by the Americans forced the Seminoles and Black Seminoles to move further into Florida, particularly southern Florida and central Florida. And several Black Seminoles continued on south, leaving Florida altogether and finding a home in the Bahamas. There is a community of Black Seminoles in the Bahamas today, in the town of Red Base to be exact. The Second Seminole War. The Second Seminole War, which took place from 1835 to 1842, marked the height of tension between the U.S. and the Seminoles and Black Seminoles. It also marked the apex of Seminole-Black Seminole alliance. The Second Seminole War began when the United States voided the Treaty of Moultrie Creek and instead demanded that the Seminoles and Black Seminoles move to Indian Territory pursuant to the Indian Removal Act of 1830. In councils before the war, the Black Seminoles threw their support behind the most militant Seminole faction, which was led by Osceola, also known as Billy Powell, who became an advisor to Mikasukis, who was the principal chief of the Seminoles from 1825 to 1849. Osceola led the Seminole resistance to removal until he was captured on October 21st, 1837. He and Mikasukis were captured under a truce. Within a few months, Osceola would die in captivity of either an intestinal infection or malaria. After the war broke out, Black Seminole leaders such as John Horace, Abraham, and John Caesar, Abraham and John Horace, who is pictured, played important roles. In addition to aiding the Seminoles in their fight, the Black Seminoles recruited enslaved Africans to rebel at the start of the war. The enslaved Africans joined the Seminoles and the Black Seminoles in the destruction of 21 sugar plantations between Christmas Day 1835 and the summer of 1836. In 1838, U.S. General Thomas Jessup tried to divide the Seminoles and the Black Seminoles by offering freedom to the Black Seminoles if they surrendered and agreed to go to Indian Territory. War-weary and truly believing that they would receive their freedom, John Horace was among the Black Seminole warriors who agreed to surrender under this condition. More than 500 Black Seminoles traveled with the Seminoles to present-day Oklahoma. Some traveled by ship across the Gulf of Mexico and up the Mississippi River, and others walked the Trail of Tears. The Third Seminole War. There would be a third war that was fought from 1855 to 1858. By this time, the majority of Black Seminoles had relocated to Oklahoma. The remaining Seminoles fought valiantly to save and protect their land. After a series of battles and while facing starvation, most of the remaining Seminoles agreed to move to Indian Territory. However, an estimated 200 to 500 Seminoles remained behind, refusing to leave. They moved deeper into the Florida Everglades onto land that American settlers considered uninhabitable. The Black Seminoles did not find a welcoming home in Oklahoma upon their arrival in 1842. Instead, they found that they had been placed in a volatile and hostile environment. They would have to contend with their old enemies, the Creeks, who were their neighbors, who often vandalized and destroyed their property. And they also had to deal with the constant threat of slave catchers, who had free reign in the territory and could enslave anyone they believed fit the description of a fugitive slave. They were only in Oklahoma for 8 years before they decided, under the leadership of John Horse, who was the leader of the Black Seminoles, and Wildcat, who was the leader of the Seminoles, to leave. Black Seminoles in Mexico. After an arduous 700-mile journey, the Black Seminoles and their Seminole brethren arrived in Mexico, where slavery had been abolished since 1829, ready to protect the Mexican border. President Vicente Guerrero had ended slavery shortly before he was ousted in a conservative coup. He was also of African descent. In return for protecting the border, the Mexican government granted the group their own land. The Black Seminole settlement was located in the northern part of Mexico, and the name of this land that they could finally call their own was El Nacimiento de los Negros Muscogulges. Negros Muscogulges is what Black Seminoles are called in Spanish. Although the Black Seminoles made the arduous trek with the group of Seminoles, the untimely death of their leader Wildcat prompted many of the Seminoles to return to Indian Territory. For the next 20 years, from 1850 to 1870, the Black Seminoles would serve the Mexican government, protecting their land from invaders and raiding parties from Texas. They would become known as a resilient, resourceful, and dependable group of fighters. During their military service, the Black Seminoles who joined the Army would become known as the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts. They served from 1870 to 1914 and were instrumental during the Texas Indian Wars. In 1870, the United States Army issued a message to John Horse, the chief of the Black Seminoles. They invited him and his band to come back to the U.S. to enlist as Indian Scouts to help fight the hostile Native Americans. Quote unquote, hostile Native Americans, I should say. In exchange for their service, they would be repatriated to Indian Territory. About 200 Black Seminoles accepted the invitation because they believed that they would be granted land, food, and other provisions, as well as reimbursement for traveling. The treaty was sent from Fort Duncan to Fort Sam Houston, but it was lost. Needless to say, none of the promises were ever kept. The initial group crossed over into Eagle Pass, Texas from Mexico on July 4th, 1870, and they were officially mustered into service on August 16th of the same year at Fort Duncan. The Scouts were moved to Fort Clark in Bracketville, Texas, about 60 miles away from Eagle Pass in 1872. Their heyday was under the command of Quaker and Civil War veteran, Lieutenant John L. Bullis. He and the Scouts enjoyed a mutual respect, trust, and admiration for each other that was unmatched. And this relationship that they had made all the difference. During their service, not a single Scout was killed or seriously injured while in battle. 4 of the Scouts were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for bravery. Their names were Adam Payne, Isaac Payne, John Ward, and Pompey Factor. Adam Payne received his award following an engagement during the Red River War that took place on September 19, 1874. 3 Seminole Negro Indian Scouts and 2 Tonkawa Scouts had been sent out by their commander, Colonel Ranald S. McKenzie, to search for enemies. During their journey, the 5 men were ambushed by 40 Kiowas. The only option was to try and fight their way out and escape. While details about the engagement are unclear, Scout Adam Payne was awarded the Medal of Honor for risking his life to save his comrades. Under fire, Payne engaged the Kiowas, allowing the other 4 men to get away. Payne's horse was shot out from under him, but he was still able to kill one of the attackers and take the horse. Payne was decorated for his habitual courage. John Ward, Isaac Payne, and Pompey Factor received their Medal of Honors in 1875 for their bravery and trustworthiness during a skirmish on April 25th against Comanches, who had raided a stagecoach on April 5th and stolen some horses. The 3 Seminole Negro Indian Scouts were with Lieutenant Bullis. They were trying to locate the Comanches, who were camping along the lower Pegasus River. A battle ensued when they found the Comanches. The Scouts dismounted and positioned themselves behind some rocks to appear as a bigger force. According to Bullis's report, we twice took their horses from them and killed 3 Indians and founded a fort. But the approximately 30 Comanches eventually realized that the group was small and attempted to surround them in order to cut them off from their horses. The 3 scouts made it to their horses, but as they made their way back to safety, they realized that Lieutenant Bullis had been left behind. Without a second thought, and while under heavy fire, they turned around and rescued their commander. Even given these exploits, back in the town of Brackettville and around the fort, the men and their families faced racism and other harsh conditions. They were often accused of and arrested for stealing and numerous other crimes. They would often flee to Mexico for refuge, returning only when the heat had died down. Even under this constant scrutiny, the men continued to serve bravely and valiantly. In 1878, Colonel Mackenzie was recalled to the fort in order to lead an expedition against the Kickapoo. This campaign effectively marked the end of the Texas Indian Wars. Most of the indigenous inhabitants of the area had either been killed or moved to reservations. On February 23, 1893, the scouts fought one last skirmish against Mexican bandits at the Las Muillas Ranch. Again, excuse my pronunciation. 30 miles north of Fort Reinbold in Starr County. The Seminoles continued to live on the fort until 1914, when they were unceremoniously disbanded. Some returned to Mexico, some stayed in the Brackettville area, and other surrounding towns. The Seminole Indian Scouts Cemetery. The Seminole Indian Scouts Cemetery was established in 1872. Among those buried there are the 4 scouts who earned the Congressional Medals of Honor: Adam Payne, Isaac Payne, John Ward, and Poby Factor. While it is a historic landmark, the Seminole Indian Scout Cemetery is a sacred place for us. For many of us, multiple family members and dear friends are buried there. And for many years, the cemetery was the only place that was ours. So as a group, we have always made sure to keep the cemetery clean and inviting for those who visit. We gather there once a year during our Seminole Day celebration to honor the memories of those who have passed. Negros Muscogulges. As discussed earlier, El Nacimiento de los Negros Muscogulges was founded in 1850. More than 170 years later, the town and its residents continue to thrive. They are proud of their Black Seminole heritage. There is a pride and tenacity that seems to permeate its sky and grounds. The folks of Nacimiento are learning their history, celebrating their culture, especially their food, singing the old Negro spirituals, and taking care of their cemetery. We are connected by history and blood, and our connection continues to strengthen and grow. The Seminole Negro Indian Scouts Museum. On April 25th, 2015, we opened our museum. It's called the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts Museum. It is small, but we are so proud of it. A lot of love went into each picture and artifact that is displayed. Everything was donated by either descendants or friends of Siska. The museum gives us a chance to tell our story in our own way. Afro-Seminole Creole. On Juneteenth, 2020, we officially began learning Afro-Seminole Creole. And if you remember, I first spoke about the Gullahs who spoke Gullah or Gullah Geechee, which is an English-based Creole with some African loanwords. They carried this language with them into Florida. Then it went with them to Oklahoma, down into Mexico, and finally back into Texas. Unfortunately, there were many factors that would see the near extinction of Afro-Seminole Creole by the time I was born. There was often a lot of shame felt by those who spoke this language, and there was always a lot of pressure to assimilate to the dominant culture and language. And as more of our elders pass away, we have come very close to losing it. But hopefully this story has a happy ending. And in so many ways, we have been so lucky. During our first meeting on Juneteenth, we had the pleasure of having Dr. Ian Hancock present. His presence was significant, incredibly important, and very emotional because he is the linguist who has studied ASC since the late 70s. He came to Brackettville and got our elders to speak in order to document this language that they thought was just a broken English. Instead, Afro-Seminole Creole is a testament to the resilience and tenacity of the people who often were placed in predicaments not of their choosing. Dr. Ian has quite literally written the book on ASC. His book is our source material that we're using to learn Afro-Seminole Creole. And he has been gracious enough to continue teaching us. And I've realized he is not only teaching us our language, but he is instilling a heavy dose of pride in us as well. And I don't think I will ever be able to adequately thank him enough for all that he has done and is doing. So in conclusion, I would like to say that we, the Black Seminoles of Mexico and Texas, are very proud of our heritage. As a unified group, we are coming together and working together to teach ourselves and others about our rich history. In both towns, our cemeteries are incredibly sacred to us. Giving our dearly departed loved ones a final resting place that is peaceful and clean is very important. In addition, we are striving to revitalize those things that we once thought were lost. This includes the old Negro spirituals that were sung way back in the Low Country region of the United States, when many of the Black Seminoles were enslaved, and the language known as Afro-Seminole Creole that has its roots in Gullah Geechee. We are proud descendants of these people who sought freedom on their own terms, and each day we strive to make them proud. And in closing, I would like to say or speak the quote that Ms. Charles has here. There is great power in one. This is what I always want, that one more person should know our history, should know our story. Ms. Charles Emily Wilson. Thank you.
Right?